Thank you all for coming today. This talk is sort of pulls together some thoughts that I and many other people actually in the room have been thinking about. From my own personal story, I have been interested in environment and resources and ecology and conservation for a long time, probably well before I got interested in economics. But my formal training is in economics. It's always been, so many people go into economics because, you know, I don't know, they like math, but they don't want to be mathematicians. I don't know. But I always viewed going into economics actually as I'm really interested in the environment. And economics to me seems like a really important set of tools and insights to bring to environmental issues. Now, when I first started my career, and sometimes I would be the only economist in a room of conservation biologists or ecologists or others, and oftentimes there was a lot of antipathy to economists, like you're part of the evil empire, you know, you're part of the problem. That's really changed over the last 20 years, and I get now so many times I'll be, again, maybe the only economist in the room of a room full of conservation biologists or others, and it's like, you know, thank God you're here. We really need to pull this together. We really need to get this green economy. We may not understand what it is, but we really think we need one. So, as I say, I'm going to try to tell you what I think this is, why it's important, and in fact, why I think it's really essential to sustainability and conservation issues generally. Okay. So in the environmental and science policy community, you know, things like climate change, so here's a picture of the glaciers, things like deforestation in general, rapid land use change, loss of biodiversity, air pollution, water pollution. These are, you know, common fare here, and certainly in this room, these are themes that emerge commonly. When you go out to the wider public, however, so I don't know if you can read this, but this is just this is a Gallup poll from last year. They asked people, what do you think is the most important problem facing the country today? The economy in general, that comes up number one. Unemployment and jobs comes up number two. If you look up and down this list, even if you can't read it, you would look long and hard. I can read it. I would look long and hard, and I don't find the environment there as the top issues facing the general public. And obviously politicians read these kinds of polls as well. Now I'm going to make the case that really understanding the economy in general, worrying about things like that, means you are worried about the environment. But you know, we're going to have to pull these thoughts together to make that case effectively. James Carville, in the Bill Clinton campaign in 1992 for president, he had three campaign statements. He was trying to get the campaign to focus, and famously he said, the economy's stupid. In other words, again, going back to that, the economy is what's central to people's minds. That's what voters are going to vote on. So we need to pay attention to that. Similarly, I think in thinking about environment and conservation issues, we really need to think about how this is impacting most people's lives in a fundamental way. But you know, right now, you might say it from the environmental point of view, it's kind of the economy's stupid, at least on the environment, right? So the environment does not factor in to the way people think about the economy. So how do we fix this problem so that it becomes more like this? And what do we mean by the green economy and smart? And I'm going to go into that in more detail now. So clearly, if you think about what counts in the economy, you know, these are sort of the standard litany of things that would come up. What doesn't count in the economy, or at least in economic accounts on a routine basis, are all the things that I mentioned on the first slide. So thinking about climate change, reducing greenhouse gases, conserving biodiversity, and so forth. So the environment is largely outside or silent in the economic accounts and in economic debates. You know, it's said that the best things in life are free, clean water, aesthetics, sense of place, so forth. but free isn't valuable in economic terms, right? And so we often fail to protect or conserve or maintain what is free. To make this point more explicitly, so this is a table or chart from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment 2005, and they looked at the trends in major ecosystem services, so things which are of value to people that are provided by nature. So we have provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, and they looked at trends, major, trying to pull together the data and say, are these things improving or going down? Again, I don't want you to look at the individual ones, but just so you know, there's more things going down than going up. I mean, the majority of ecosystem services, Millennium Ecosystem Assessment said, were in decline. It's really interesting, though, if you look at the pattern of which ones were increasing and which ones were declining. So there are some that are going up, and these tend to be things like food production or livestock or aquaculture. These are things which actually are marketed commodities, right? So those things which have gone through a market system, which show up in the standard economic accounts, are things which actually we have done a good job of conserving or maintaining or enhancing. Those things which are outside of the market economy or don't show up in economic accounts have almost uniformly gone down, declined through time. So, we used to say you get what you pay for. Well, the converse of that is you don't get what you don't pay for. So how do we fix this problem or think about, so working with the Natural Capital Project, I usually think of a term called mainstreaming the value of nature, mainstreaming ecosystem services. So how do we factor the value of nature, the value of ecosystem services into everyday decisions of individuals, of businesses, of government agencies? So this is not something that's external or a nice thought afterwards, but this is thought about in the same way that businesses would think about other, paying other costs, like they have to hire labor and they have to pay taxes. Well, there are real costs to causing environmental harm. So how do we bring that to be a real cost, provide real incentives? So, the point here is accounting for the value of nature should be part of mainstream economic thinking, not something that's nice or off to the side. It's part of, it should be central. I mean, so I would hope that 10 years from now, when I'm teaching economics classes, that it isn't, oh, I'm just going to do environmental economics off to the side here. This would be sort of routine, standard. Well, it's kind of interesting to go back a little bit in time and think about economic accounts, and because what I'm really saying here is the environment is sort of invisible in the economic accounts. Well, we didn't really have economic accounts, so all of those things like income and jobs and the statistics that we take for granted today, GDP, gross domestic product, we didn't have those things prior to the 1930s. There was a consistent or concerted effort in the, starting in the late 1920s, but really in the 1930s, through the Great Depression, people said, we can't be flying blind. This is actually a cartoon. That's supposed to be Ben Bernanke. I don't know that really looks like Ben Bernanke, former Fed chairman. But anyway, this notion of flying blind, we didn't know what was going on in the economy. We did not have a reliable set of statistics. We didn't have a uniform way of looking at the problem. Through the 1930s, these were developed. So we had first estimates of national income, first estimates of GDP, which we take for granted now. These are fairly recent developments, is the point. Now, GDP is often maligned, and I think rightfully so, if you try to interpret it as a measure of welfare or a measure of sustainability. That's not what it was designed to do. It's a measure simply of the flow of income through the economy. Now, the problem on the environment, again, is that we don't measure the flow of environmental goods and services, the flow of value from nature in these standard accounts. So we really need to come up with new measures. And I'm sorry, I hope my voice lasts for another 10 minutes. It's showing signs of cracking now, but okay. So how do we fix this problem? How do we get to this, quote, green economy and account for the value of nature as part of standard economic measures? Another way of saying this is, you know, ecosystem services, clearly these are goods and services of value to people. How can we get these to count in the same way that traditional commodities, traditional goods and services do? So if I went to a measure of GDP, I'd actually have a measure that included the value of these ecosystem services. Thank you. In economics, there's accounts, the flow of value right now, but there's also a capital account, so a measure of wealth. Can we count natural capital and changes in natural capital, either appreciation or depreciation of natural capital? Can we capture that as well in the economic accounts? Now, there's a lot of work going on across the world right now on this. These are 6 prominent reports all in the last 10 years and I've had actually the fortune to work on, or the misfortune to work on all but one of them. So this one's from the UK, that one I didn't work on, but all the rest. A UN report on inclusive wealth. This is TEEB, which is the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. The Natural Capital Project put out a book inspiringly called Natural Capital, or strangely called Natural Capital. Anyway, this is the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and then a National Research Council report on valuing ecosystem services. These are the ones just that I'm mostly familiar with. There are other efforts going on as well. So there's a big push now. A lot of people recognize this problem, and a big push to try to fix this. As I said, I've been working with a group called the Natural Capital Project, which is a partnership between the Institute on the Environment here, Stanford University, and 2 of the largest conservation NGOs, so the Nature Conservancy and World Wildlife Fund. And I'm going to just very quickly report, some of you have seen this before, if you've seen my presentations. I want to just show you that there are, let's try that again. There are, that's better, applications of science, both natural science as well as economics, to get to the question of how could we think about alternative decisions that are made, in this case at landscape scales, both in the Willamette Basin in Oregon and in Minnesota, to evaluate if we make alternative decisions, in this case on land use, how does that affect the bottom line? And I'll compare the bottom line sometimes without ecosystem services to show you what a traditional economic accounting would show, and then with ecosystem services into the mix, and show how that decision context or that weighting of alternatives would change if you had a more complete accounting that incorporated the values of nature in along with the standard commodities that go into economic accounts. Okay, so the first one is a paper that came out in Frontiers in 2009. Eric Nelson, who was both a graduate student here and a postdoc, was the lead author on. This is in the Willamette Basin in Oregon, Western Oregon. The kind of the spine of the Cascade, ridge of the Cascades is right here. You have primarily forested area, valley floor. This is agricultural area. You've got cities in the dark there. And the question here was this was land use in 1990. There were various projections that were put forward about what is the valley going to, what's the basin going to look like in 2050. So 3 different scenarios, one more conservation oriented, one more development oriented, and one kind of business as usual, which, you know, comes out actually very much like the development oriented one. So if you just project ahead trends versus you think about development, those 2 actually are fairly similar. The conservation one is a little bit dissimilar. It's probably hard to see that. You have to, you know, hone in on the details. But what we did was we used a set of models to evaluate. So we actually had a map, a spatially explicit plan of what happened where in the basin in terms of housing development, in terms of timber production, agriculture production, what was left aside for conservation areas, where was pasture, and so on. We ran through a set of models looking at water quality, carbon sequestration, a very simple biodiversity model, and market value, which combined timber production value, agricultural crop production value, and housing value. So everything that went through the market is here. All the things that did not go through the market are in these other 5 categories. So storm peak management is really about flooding and flooding potential. Okay, so we evaluated a map, spatially explicit map in every decade between 1990 and 2050, evaluated under these 3 plans. And the point or way to summarize this as follows. So the circles over here are kind of the traditional economic accounts. So if I just looked at the market value of commodities on the horizontal axis, what I'm getting here is that the development and plan trends scenarios give me higher market value. On the vertical axis, I've got a measure of biodiversity, which I'm not going to put in dollar terms. And what you have here is if we just look at the traditional marketed commodities versus biodiversity, we get this negative relationship. So if I want more biodiversity, I've got to give up returns to commercial activities. Then we said, well, let's turn the tables a little bit. Let's change the incentives here and change the institutions, and let's pay people for, let's make carbon basically a commodity, or let's assess the value of sequestering carbon in the Willamette Basin, and let's add that to the value of these marketed commodities. So the difference between the triangles and the circles is simply we're adding in the value of carbon sequestration. Now, we're not adding in the value of water protection or storm protection or biodiversity that matter. We're just simply adding in one of the values of nature. But what you can see is now we've changed the ranking between these 3 alternatives, right? So previously, the development and plan trend had higher value in traditional economic terms. Now the conservation scenario has higher value, right? So we've changed the ranking of the alternatives simply by adding in what should be there, right? This is a real value of nature. And as I said, we didn't add in even all of the values of nature. Give you one other example closer to home this time, which gives you kind of the same type of assessment. So this was in Minnesota. We analyzed used, sorry, try that again. Used, there we go, much better. We used actual land use change between 1992 and 2001, and we compared this to a set of admittedly hypothetical scenarios. So we said, what would happen, sort of simple rules, what would happen if we allowed no agricultural expansion? So land could come out of agriculture, but it couldn't expand into it, or no urban expansion, or we expanded agriculture into everything which was high soil class. So we had soil classes 1 through 8. Everything that was in soil class 1 and 2 went into agriculture, even if it wasn't in there before. So you can see these different alternatives. The point that I want to make here is not the details of these scenarios, but the following. So if I compare what happens when I add in kind of what I would think of as a more complete accounting, and I look at the rankings, the one that comes out the highest is this scenario, followed closely by several others, including a conservation scenario where we set aside land along streams and buffers and took out highly erodible land. But if I take these things out and I just look at traditional economic accounting, the one that comes in highest is the agricultural expansion. And that actually came in the lowest up here. So again, these things are very sensitive. What you think of as a good outcome greatly depends upon what you're counting, right? And we systematically leave out of our current accounting the value of nature. So by doing that, we systematically get the wrong decisions being made. Okay, my point in going through these is to make that point, but also to show you that we actually, this is not a failure of science. I mean, this was not, I didn't have to work too hard to do this. I mean, if you wanted me to do this someplace else and gave me the data, we could do this. I mean, there's no shortage of these kinds of stories out there. Okay, so, but that's not going to solve the problem at this point. This is not a problem of, oh, we don't know what to do, we don't have this information. So how do we think about actually implementing or achieving the green economy, the road ahead? And this is just sort of a cheesy, using on the road was because I really like this picture. So, the one cheetah who's looking off to the future. Okay. All right. So how do we think about creating the green economy? Well, there's lots of ways to do this. So one way that's been talked about a lot, it involves some government action at the beginning. So an agreement that it's important to limit certain harmful activities like emissions of greenhouse gases or emissions of air pollutants or water pollutants. So there's been various proposals for cap and trade. We actually have a very successful, or had a very successful cap and trade system in the United States for sulfur dioxide emissions. It's been tried out for water pollution in various places. So there are examples of this. Europe has had emissions trading scheme in carbon. California, China is now doing so. So there are a number of examples of where this has actually been put into practice. We know a number of the difficulties and worked out a number of the issues of actual implementation here. But it does require a will at the first point to say there needs to be some government action to limit emissions of some harmful activity, for example. In fisheries, a very related idea, individual transferable quotas. So the quotas, or the number of permits handed out, limit the total allowable catch. You allow these to be traded among the fishing fleet, so the economist is happy because you get efficiency, and who is it that's fishing? The fisheries biologists are happy if you set the allowable catch in the right place so you get sustainable harvest. In the land area, we have tradable development rights that have been proposed and in a couple of places enacted, but this isn't as widely done as some of these others. Under the Clean Water Act, we have wetland banking. So if I want to develop in a certain area and remove wetlands, I need to go to the bank and have, basically there has to be a suitable amount of restored wetlands that have been created that I can trade my destruction of wetlands for. So there are a number of ways that we can create markets for environmental goods that are like markets for traditional goods and services. Many of you have heard of payments for ecosystem services. So we can set up incentive schemes where essentially there's a price for creating these ecosystem services or green goods. So in Costa Rica, their payments for ecosystem services program, probably the largest one on the planet. In China, the sloping lands conversion program, literally involving hundreds of thousands of people and hundreds of thousands of hectares. Pulling land, steeply sloped land out of production, agricultural production, and putting it into perennial vegetation with a number of ecosystem services related to erosion control, flood control, and so on. In Latin America, water funds, so payment by municipal water suppliers to upstream landowners to do practices that provide clean water downstream. In the US, we have the Conservation Reserve Program, and although it wasn't designed initially as a payment for ecosystem services, it shares many of the same features as payments for ecosystem services. So these are payments to farmers to set land out of annual crop production and into perennials, and provides a number of habitat, carbon sequestration, water quality benefits. Okay, so those are all ways to do this. We can go another route. We can say, well, there are also taxes, and in a way, payments for ecosystem services are subsidies to provide green goods. But we could go the other way. We could tax things which are causing environmental harm. So under these environmental taxes in Europe, there's very high gasoline taxes, part of which could be said are for environmental purposes. In the Nordic countries, they have taxes on sulfur, which are explicitly environmental taxes. Closer to home, so I worked with several environmental groups. Just recently, so in December, there was the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. It's very interesting, so a little bit of background is the Public Utilities Commission has rules that had been put in place back in the 1990s that says that they are supposed to account for basically the full cost, the environmental costs of electricity generation. So when we're planning for should we site a coal-fired power plant or another kind of power plant to generate electricity, for planning purposes, we're supposed to account for the complete set of costs, not just the marketed costs, but the complete set of costs. When I first heard about this, I thought, this is this is exactly the kind of thing we want. We actually want people to factor in the costs. Well, the problem was that the costs that are currently on the books are insanely low. Like, there is no damage for sulfur dioxide emissions from power plants because EPA has regulated it. No, there are still damages from sulfur dioxide emissions. The value of carbon is an order of magnitude below what recent estimates from the federal government and elsewhere say are the real costs associated with additional carbon emissions. So there is a hearing before the PUC to say we need to update these numbers. The PUC said, yes, we agree, we need to rethink this, and going forward, we're going to have, I hope, an update of these numbers to hopefully get us an accurate estimate of what are the external or environmental costs of electricity. This is, they asked me if this was, I'm missing a picture here. It's like, yes, there is a missing picture here. U.S. environmental taxes, we don't like this in the U.S., but okay. There are other routes. So we could go with voluntary approaches, so certification. And in fact, Derek Pennington, you're here, right? Derek has a project now to evaluate how well various certification programs are going. So, in forestry, there's the FFC and others. We've got in agriculture a number of different certifications, including the Soy Roundtable for soybean producers. Most of us have heard about Energy Star as a way of sort of signaling how energy efficient things are in buildings. There's LEED standards. So there are a number of certification schemes out there, and these work voluntarily so you hope that consumers are going to be willing to pay a premium for things which are certified as being efficient, energy efficient, or conservation friendly or environmentally friendly. And then finally, there's a lot of efforts in corporate sustainability. So I've been working with people from the Nature Conservancy. I have a partnership with Dow, trying to incorporate the value of nature to Dow operations and to the larger public from Dow operations. There's a Coca-Cola WWF partnership. Again, Derek knows more details about that than I do. Many other examples, Walmart, Unilever, Nike, a whole host of companies that are interested in this. And I guess the question is, sort of how far and how fast are we going? And sort of stay tuned. In summary, my view of this field right now is there's certainly no shortage of knowledge about the value of nature. I mean, there are groups like ours, the Natural Capital Project, a lot of work that's being done through the Global Lands Initiative here at the Institute on the Environment and elsewhere. A recent report that came out in Science from a group of natural scientists and economists in England and the UK pointing out how ecosystem services are going to likely change under land use change and climate change there. So, as of maybe 10 years ago, I would have said, we're not real good at doing this. I don't feel that anymore. I think that we actually have the numbers here, the science that can back up much better societal decision making than we're currently doing. I also, as I hope I've convinced you, I don't think there's actually a shortage of mechanisms for how to go forward. Some of this going through government action, like the environmental taxes. Some of this going through the private sector, so corporate sustainability, certification. There's a lot of ways forward. None of them necessarily work perfectly, but there's a lot of, again, I don't think it's a shortage either of the science or of ways forward of how do we get to mainstream ecosystem services. What I'm seeing a shortage of right now, and actually I'm sitting in a group with a group next door, both from here from the Institute on the Environment, and also people working both with Natural Capital Project and a new initiative, Earth Genome, to really think about how do we put this knowledge to work? How do we go from the science all the way through to making a difference on the ground, to changing societal decisions? And I'd love to open it up to discussion now, because I really think of what we're all struggling with, at least a lot of us in this community are struggling with, is how do we get that large-scale shift in thinking and behavior so that we actually do have this smart economy, that we actually incorporate into our decisions the value of nature. And with that, let me stop and open it up for questions.
We'll get some questions, and please wait for the microphone so the online audience can also hear your voice.